G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 5, the book reading, partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. We resume the second part of A Victory Simply to Survive. And so say all of us. Arr. On patrol with the ARVNs, 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 Army of the Republican of Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta. Note the spare combat boot strapped onto the machine gunner's backpack. There's not a great deal of photography in this copy, so I'm afraid we're going to see lots of photos again and again. One has to break up the text somehow. The ARVN patrols did not eat anything during the day, and breakfast was a handful of dried fruit, fish or jerky, dried meat. In the evening, if they were not setting up an ambush, there might be some soup and rice eked out with weeds or some vegetables. Drinking water was from the paddies purified with tablets. The Vietnamese soldiers did on occasions drink the paddy water, but a Westerner never could. I always had to remember to take tablets because you could die of thirst surrounded by paddy water. Davis expected action on all his patrols with the ARVN and generally got it. There was always contact of some kind. It depended on the area and what the intentions of the communists were, because that governed the action. In the early stages, they held to the old tried and true communist guerrilla warfare adage: attack your enemy only when you know you have the strength and upper hand. Therefore, if you were attacked while you were with the South Vietnamese unit, you knew you were at a disadvantage. And you also knew that you weren't going to get any strong air bombardment or artillery support because you were generally well out of range of help. Later in the war, a conventional pattern developed in which the North Vietnamese army, reinforced by the Viet Cong, did attempt to take over complete areas and hold them to deny access to Allied forces. But early on, it was pure guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong would usually attack late in the afternoon when Neil and the ARVN troops had been walking through the paddy fields for 12 or 13 hours. They were hot, tired, and at a low ebb. They would hit you just as the sun was going down, and they could see you, and we would all have a dreadful time through the night surviving. In the morning, the attack would continue, and we usually managed to fight our way out of it. The ARVN lost a lot of soldiers in these clashes. Sometimes 30 or 40% of a unit were wounded, were casualties. They never announced the number wounded, only deaths. Sometimes their casualties would be as high as 50 or 60%. Totally unacceptable in a Western army. But they had to be accepted by the Vietnamese. There was no other way. Nobody was going to come and help bail them out. They were either defeated and wiped out, or they got back. On many occasions, it was not a question of defeating the enemy. It was a victory simply to survive. Hence the chapter heading. There were military successes. The Viet Cong had exceptions to their golden rules. Sometimes they would be caught in the advance of 2 battalions of ARVN troops, about 1,000 men. One tactic was to leave behind small suicide units of Viet Cong to hold up the advance while the main body withdrew and regrouped. These small groups would hold up the ARVN advance and die to a man. Unlike the Americans, who always telegraphed their punches in advance by blanket bombing or artillery strikes, the South Vietnamese would often move quietly into an area and take the Viet Cong unawares. Skirmishes erupted that way, but the big battles were always initiated by the Viet Cong. Neil Davis's aim on each field trip was to centre his story on a particular character, one of the infantrymen, the radio operator, or a grenade thrower. They had specialists in the field, but they weren't really trained in these specific skills and had to pick up their expertise as they went along. On occasions, an individual I had chosen for that kind of profile was killed during the operation. I personalised the story to try and get over to the viewer the hardships and humanity of the Vietnamese fighting the war. that they weren't funny little animals running around as their allies liked to depict them. I wanted to show them as compassionate people, with a feeling for their fellow human beings, for their families, and for life itself, and for their own lives, even though they gave those lives courageously on many occasions. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 10 July 1965, Orange Grove Road, Singapore. It's so difficult to explain from so far away, but just because the Viet Cong are communists doesn't naturally make them enemies of all the people. Rather, it is easier to forget that one side is communist and the other not, and look on it as a very horrible and bloody civil war with both sides able to put up fairly convincing arguments to back them up. When you hear that a government battalion has been overrun, it means that about 500 men have been killed, bracket, not counting enemy losses, close bracket, plus, of course, anyone with them. Also, when you hear that a Viet Cong village has been bombed, you can imagine how many women, children, and innocent people are killed in this way. Think what would be the result if Sorel, bracket, which has the same population of a small village here, was practically bombed off the face of the earth in order to get rid of the undesirable elements there. It's difficult to understand the different outlook the people have in Vietnam. Indeed, they must, otherwise they would live in a state of perpetual hysteria. I told my company Viz News about the offer from CBS, and they sent a representative to see me here and talk about what I wanted. They said all sorts of nice things, bracket, in a letter, close bracket, about how well I had done and so on, but I think they still got quite a shock when they realised that I operate here on such a relatively small scale, compared to the American companies who are our strongest competitors. That we have been able to do so well in the face of all this astounded them so much that they immediately raised my salary by about 50% and gave me virtually an open order to do as I pleased. The outcome is that I will have a permanent apartment in Singapore at their expense. I will also have an office and apartment in Saigon, and authority to employ a full-time Vietnamese to take the fiddling jobs off my hands, like customs clearances and official passes, which never seem to end. So all in all, things have turned out satisfactorily. 31 years old, single, getting paid to make movies about people who play combat with real guns. All he had to do was to stay alive, and he did that for 21, 22 years. Next episode, we'll have a look at Saigon, Pearl of the Orient. Ciao.